Prologue, The Whispering Winds of Soganli 555 AD. The valley of Soganli stretched before him, a landscape carved by fire and time, its jagged ridges and towering stone spires jutting toward the heavens like the fingers of a long-buried god. The land was silent, save for the wind, a ceaseless, whispering breath that coiled through the abandoned village like a lingering specter. The monk shivered beneath his woolen robe, tightening the rough fabric around his shoulders as he picked his way carefully through the desolate ruins. The village had been lifeless for decades, its homes hollowed out of rock, their entrances dark and yawning like the mouths of forgotten tombs. What had happened here? The stories he had heard in distant monasteries were little more than fragmented whispers, tales of a place cursed by an unspeakable evil, a village consumed by something more terrifying than plague or war. They called it the Valley of the Dolls. He had not believed it at first. The accounts were inconsistent, absurd even. Mothers who had sewn charms of cotton and thread, dolls that whispered in the night, a fire that had devoured the land itself. A woman who had defied darkness, and in doing so, had doomed them all. But the rumors had led him here, and as he stood in the heart of the abandoned village, the weight of those whispers pressed down upon him. Something had happened here. And something remained. The House of Dolls. His feet crunched over brittle grass and scattered debris as he approached one of the larger homes, its arched doorway half collapsed, its stone walls weathered by time. A cold gust rushed past him as he stepped inside, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of ash. The air within was still, heavy. His breath hitched. They were here. Hundreds of them. Dolls. They were everywhere. Lined along the crumbling shelves, propped against walls, some seated on stone benches as if waiting for the return of those who had left them behind. Their faces, crafted from fabric and stitched with careful precision, were eerily lifelike, their eyes, some embroidered, others made of tiny, polished stones, watching him from every direction. The monk's fingers twitched toward the simple wooden cross that hung from his neck. These were no ordinary dolls. They should have rotted. The moisture and the passing years should have reduced them to dust. And yet, they remained untouched, their colors only slightly faded, as though the hands that had made them had only just set them down. He moved slowly through the room, his sandaled feet disturbing a fine layer of soot on the floor. There had been a fire here once. A great fire. But the dolls, how had they survived? The wind outside howled against the rock, and for the first time since he had entered, he realized that the house was too quiet. The sound of his own breathing seemed deafening in the stillness. And then, a whisper. Laughter. Children's laughter. Faint, distant. His blood ran cold. The monk spun around, scanning the room, but there was nothing, only the lifeless dolls, their stitched mouths frozen in silence. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It was just the wind. It had to be. He took a step forward and nearly tripped over a small object resting against the base of the wall. When he bent down, his breath caught in his throat. It was a doll. Not just any doll. This one was different. The fabric was a deep, burnt crimson, its threadwork intricate, its form smaller than the others. The eyes, two tiny, glistening beads of obsidian, gleamed in the dim light. Something about it unnerved him. His fingers hesitated before reaching for it, and when he finally did, an icy shiver crawled up his spine. The fabric was cold, not the soft warmth of cloth, but something unnatural. He traced his thumb over its face, over the delicate stitches that formed a mouth. And then his chest tightened. He had seen this kind of careful work before. His nephew. He'd buried a nephew once. The memory hit him like a fist. The boy had been so young, taken too soon. He remembered the way his sister had clutched the child's blanket as they lowered the tiny body into the earth. How she had sewn small dolls in his memory, whispering prayers with every stitch. This doll. It felt like those prayers. Like grief, woven into thread. He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. Who had made this? Who had left it here? And why? Why did it feel like it was waiting for him? The whispers return. The wind shifted. The air grew thicker, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. Then, a voice. Soft, almost inaudible. Feed us. His breath left him in a sharp gasp. The monk dropped the doll, stumbling backward. The whisper had been real, it had been inside the room with him. His eyes darted to the doorway, his instinct screaming at him to run. But something kept him frozen. The whisper had not come from a person. It had come from all around him. From the walls. From the floor. From the dolls. He dared another look at them, and a terrible certainty settled in his chest. They were watching. No, not watching, waiting. The obsidian-eyed doll lay on the ground where he had dropped it, its mouth stitched in a perpetual, silent smile. The monk clenched his jaw, his trembling fingers reaching for the satchel at his side. He needed to record this. He needed to write it down before the whispers drove him mad. He unrolled a scroll of parchment, his ink-stained fingers struggling to hold his quill steady. In the year of our Lord 555, I, Brother Elias, have come upon the cursed valley of Soganli, where none dare tread. The stories are true. The village is empty, yet it breathes. The air is thick with the ghosts of sorrow. The dolls. He hesitated, swallowing hard. The dolls remain. The wind howled again, rattling the stones. And for the first time, he swore he heard something move. Something small. Something soft. His head snapped toward the crimson doll. It was no longer where he had dropped it. The monk's breath turned to ice. Had it moved? Or had something else moved it? The room was too dark. The air was too thick. The whispers had stopped, but he could still feel them. Still feel their hunger. Forcing himself to stand, he snatched up his satchel, shoving his scroll inside. His hands were shaking. He needed to leave, now. As he turned, his foot brushed against something, sending it rolling across the floor. His stomach twisted as he looked down. The crimson doll. It was at his feet again. Facing him. Waiting. Smiling. The legend begins. Brother Elias did not sleep that night. He did not rest. He sat with his back pressed against the cold rock of a ruined house, the wind moaning through the valley, the dolls standing in silent vigil all around him. By morning, he would leave this place. But the tale of Agana, the mother who defied the hungry ones, who stitched sorrow into cotton and fire into thread, would remain. And whether the world believed him or not, he would write it. Because some stories refuse to die. And some whispers never fade. Chapter 1, The Land That Burned Before Man. The arrival of the first people. Long before the whispering winds carried the legend of Soganli, before the name of the valley was ever spoken by human lips, the land existed in solitude. It was a place of fire and silence, where the earth itself had torn open, spewing molten rock into the heavens. The ground trembled under the weight of unseen forces, reshaping the terrain with every eruption. For thousands of years, no living soul dared to claim this valley. The Fairy Chimneys, towering rock formations left behind by the retreating fire, stood as sentinels of a land carved by catastrophe. Their hollowed shapes, twisting toward the sky, bore the scars of ancient violence. The people who came later, who built their homes within the stone and whispered prayers into the wind, would believe these formations to be the tombs of forgotten gods. But in the beginning, there were no names for them. No offerings laid at their bases. No prayers woven into their walls. Only silence. Then came the first wanderers. The earliest settlers were nomads, travelers who moved with the rhythm of the seasons, always searching for water, shelter, and fertile soil. They crossed the rugged Anatolian landscape, guided by instinct, following the rivers that carved through the land like veins. When they reached the valley, they hesitated. The earth here felt different. Even as the grass had begun to reclaim the land, the scars of fire remained. The soil was richer than any they had seen, darkened by the remnants of ancient ash, and the towering chimneys of stone loomed over them like watchers from another world. The people did not know what to make of them. Some saw them as a gift from the gods, a natural fortress where they could build their homes. Others murmured of omens, of spirits that still lingered beneath the rock. But in the end, hunger outweighed fear. And so, the first people of Soganli made the valley their own. A land of gods and ghosts. As the seasons passed, the settlers grew familiar with the land, its rhythm, its bounty, and its shadows. They learned to fear the sudden tremors that sometimes shook the ground, the distant groans that came from deep beneath the hills. They watched as flames danced on the horizon when the mountains spit fire in the distance. Some among them, the wise ones, the dreamers, the ones who heard whispers on the wind, began to speak of the valley as something more than land. They said it was alive. They said it had a memory. And they called the Fairy Chimneys tombs. Tombs of something greater than men. They began to treat the formations with reverence, with caution, with fear. They laid small offerings at their bases, bones of animals, carved stones, bowls of water, tokens meant to appease the unseen. But what they did not know, what they could never have known, was that something already stirred beneath the earth. Something older than their gods, older than their language. Something waiting. The buried fires. Though the valley had long since cooled, the people could still feel the heat in certain places. The caves that they carved into the soft stone walls were warm, even in the dead of winter. When the wind moved through the chimneys, it sounded like voices. Some claimed to hear their ancestors calling. Others whispered that the sounds were not human at all. Yet, despite their fears, the people flourished. They built huts from dried reeds and mud, dug into the hillsides, shaped the stone to serve as homes and granaries. Their numbers grew, their children laughed in the shadows of the fairy chimneys, and for a time, it seemed they had tamed the land. Then came the first signs. It began beneath the soil. The earth shifted when no storms came. The water in the wells darkened for days at a time. And then there were the fires. Not the great eruptions of old, not the fire that had shaped the land, but something else. Small, flickering embers would appear at night, burning in places where no fuel lay. They would gutter and die before morning, leaving behind no ashes, no warmth, only the faint scent of something charred. Some said it was the breath of the old gods. Others said it was something hungry. The first dreamers. There were those among the people who saw things others could not. The dreamers, the ones who spoke with spirits, who read the sky and the earth and the movement of water. It was they who first warned that the valley was not meant to be theirs. One woman, old and bent with age, woke from a terrible dream and told the others what she had seen. She spoke of fire without flame. Of stone that wept blood. Of something buried beneath the valley that had begun to stir. But the people did not listen. Why should they? Their crops had never grown richer. Their children had never been stronger. Whatever was beneath the earth had remained there for generations. Why should it rise now? And so they dismissed the dreamers as old women spinning tales. Until the night the sky turned red. The omen in the sky. The fire began in the heavens. It streaked across the night, an angry wound splitting the darkness apart. It was a sign, a warning written in flame, and the people gathered in terror, clutching their children, whispering to the gods they knew. But no god answered. That night, the earth trembled beneath them. The walls of their homes shuddered, cracked. A deep, groaning sound echoed through the valley, coming from the stone itself. And when the people ran to the chimneys, to the places they had long called the tombs of the forgotten, they saw something they could not explain. The stone wept. Dark rivulets seeped from cracks in the rock, thicker than water, darker than blood. The air reeked of charred earth and something older, something foul. And in the silence that followed, the people finally understood. They had settled upon a graveyard. A graveyard of something that was never meant to wake. The departure and the silence that followed. By dawn, the people of Soganli knew their fate. They gathered their belongings, their children, their livestock, and they left. Some wept, some whispered prayers, some cast final offerings at the bases of the chimneys in desperate, useless gestures. But they all left. No one dared to remain. And for centuries, the valley stood empty. The wind continued to whisper. The earth did not tremble again. But the embers still flickered at night. And the stone continued to weep. Waiting. Waiting for those who would come next. Waiting for the ones who would not listen. Waiting for the sorrow that would awaken it once more. Closing reflection. The land of Soganli was never meant to belong to men. They had tried to claim it, to carve homes from its walls, to bury their dead in its soil. But some places do not forget. Some places remember what was taken from them, and they wait. And in the centuries that followed, long after the first people had fled, others would come. They would find the fairy chimneys and marvel at their beauty. They would carve homes into their hollowed bodies. They would sing, and work, and laugh, and love. And, as always, they would not listen. Not until it was too late. Not until the land remembered them, too. Not until the hungry ones awoke again. Chapter 2, The Buried Evil. The Descent Beneath the Earth. For years, the settlers of Soganli flourished. Their homes, carved into the soft rock, shielded them from the scorching Anatolian sun and the bitter winter winds. The valley, once feared for its desolate silence, had become a haven. But the land was never meant to be tamed. And soon, they would discover why. It began as an accident. The settlers had long since expanded their dwellings beyond the surface, tunneling deeper into the stone, fashioning storerooms and meeting halls in the cool embrace of the underground. Some among them, the stone carvers, the diggers, the dreamers who saw things that others ignored, believed the valley held deeper mysteries, deeper truths. It was these men, the ones who sought to unearth the past, who struck the chamber. At first, they believed it to be a simple cave, an untouched hollow beneath the rock, its walls slick with time, untouched by human hands. But as their torches flickered against the stone, they saw the markings. Carvings. Deep, deliberate, not of their own making. The chamber of whispers. The men hesitated. The valley was old. They all knew this. It had existed before them, before their ancestors, before even the gods they worshipped. But never had they found proof of those who came before. Not until now. Their torches revealed figures carved into the walls, twisting shapes that seemed to move when the flames flickered. The men did not understand the symbols. They did not understand the meaning behind the twisting spirals, the distorted faces, the open mouths frozen in silent screams. But they felt them. Felt them in their bones. Felt them in the way the air thickened, the way the silence turned suffocating. One of the elders, a man who had spent his life carving homes into the rock, shaping stone into shelter, stepped forward, pressing his palm against the cold surface. And then, a whisper. So soft, so faint, that he thought he had imagined it. Until the others heard it too. A voice, or many voices, layered upon one another, woven into the very rock itself. Muttering. Whispering. Waiting. Then the ground shuddered. A low groan echoed through the cave, a sound not of stone shifting, but of something awakening. The men stumbled backward, panic rising in their chests. And above them, in the village, the earth cracked. The breaking of the seal. The tremor that followed shook the valley to its bones. It was not like the earthquakes they had known before, the ones that rumbled deep beneath the land and passed without consequence. No, this was different. It felt alive. As if something beneath them was pushing upward, pressing against the stone, demanding to be freed. The people fled from their homes, watching in horror as cracks snaked through the valley floor, splitting open like veins. A great plume of dust rose from the underground chamber, spewing into the sky like the breath of a sleeping beast exhaling after centuries of silence. And in that moment, the whispers became a roar. It came from beneath them, around them, inside them. And for the first time in their history, the settlers of Soganli felt the presence of the hungry ones. The first night of fear. At first, there was only silence. The tremors ceased. The valley stood still. The people, shaken but unscathed, believed they had survived the worst. They were wrong. The first to notice the ash were the women who gathered water. The river, once clear, now carried dark flecks, tiny specks that drifted on the surface, dissolving when touched, leaving behind a scent both familiar and wrong. Like burnt wood. Like something that had once been alive. Then came the shadows. At first, they were nothing more than flickers in the corners of the eye. Dark shapes where no shadow should be. Brief, fleeting. The people dismissed them. A trick of the mind, they said. A consequence of the earthquake, of the dust and the shifting light. Then came the voices. Children woke screaming in the night, swearing they had heard whispers inside their rooms. The shepherds, watching over their flocks, spoke of a presence among the stones, of something that moved without form, without footsteps. And always, always, the faint scent of ash. It clung to their clothes, to their homes, to their skin. And in the darkness of the valley, where the fire had once burned, something waited. The naming of the hungry ones. It was the elders who first spoke the name. Not because they understood, not because they knew what had been unleashed, but because naming a thing gave it form. And they needed it to have form. They needed to understand the fear that lurked beneath the surface of their thoughts, that slithered through their dreams, that pressed against their ribs like unseen hands. So they called them the hungry ones. Not spirits. Not gods. Something else. Something without a body, without a face. Something that watched, always watched, but never moved. Something that did not breathe, did not eat, did not sleep. But still, it hungered. The forgotten wrath. The elders sought answers in the carvings they had unearthed, hoping to find meaning in the twisting shapes, in the silent screams. But the more they studied, the less they understood. The figures were not prayers. They were not warnings. They were pleas. Pleas that had gone unanswered. The ones who had lived here before, whoever they had been, had sealed something away. Not to protect themselves. To protect the world from it. And now, it was free. The first vanishing. It was a child. A boy no older than 6 summers. One moment, he had been playing at the edge of the village, running between the towering stones, his laughter echoing against the rock. The next. Gone. No sound, no scream. Only the lingering scent of ash. They searched for days. Through the caves, through the tunnels, through the hills beyond the valley. But he was gone. And so was the laughter. The watching eyes. In the weeks that followed, the valley grew quieter. The children did not stray far. The shepherds did not go to the hills. The women whispered over their work, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to see something standing behind them. Even the wind changed. It no longer carried the same song. Instead, it breathed. Slow, heavy. Like something waiting. And the shadows. The shadows did not disappear. They lingered. They watched. And though no one saw them move, no one heard them whisper, no one could prove they were real. The people of Soganli knew. Knew that something had risen from beneath the earth. Knew that the land was no longer theirs. Knew that they had awakened something that had been meant to sleep forever. And for the first time in centuries, they wondered. Would the valley ever let them leave? Chapter 3, The First Sacrifice. The Night of Vanishing Cradles. The first child had disappeared without a sound. His mother had placed him in his cradle, as she had done every night since he was born, whispering a prayer of protection before stepping away to tend the evening fire. He had been healthy, full of laughing warmth, his tiny hands always reaching for the strands of her hair. And yet, when she returned, the cradle was empty. No trace of struggle. No signs of how he had been taken. Only the faintest scent of ash in the air. The village searched, calling his name, combing the hills, the caves, the riverbanks. They searched until their voices were raw, until their hands were scraped and bloodied from tearing through the earth. But the boy was gone. They told themselves it was a tragedy, an accident. That he had wandered into the hills, been lost to the night. Until it happened again. Another child. Then another. The grief turned to terror. Mothers clung to their children, tying them to their own bodies with cloth. Fathers stood guard through the night, weapons in hand, but no blade, no fire, no prayer could stop it. The children were vanishing. And always, the cradles were left behind, untouched except for the same blackened soot, the same faint claw marks. Marks that no beast could have made. The first accusations. Fear does not remain silent for long. At first, they looked for an enemy among them. Had someone taken the children? Had a wandering tribe stolen them away in the night? Had some spirit of the valley, a god, a demon, something they had unknowingly offended, claimed them as punishment. The elders gathered, voices raised in the torchlight, casting accusations in desperation. "It is the women," some murmured. "It is their grief calling misfortune upon us." "It is the caves," others said. "We should never have disturbed them." But there was no one to blame. No footprints led away from the cradles. No animal tracks in the dust. The only sign that anything had happened was the scent of ash lingering in the air, faint, clinging to the stone-like breath. It was them. The hungry ones. The name had been spoken in whispers, but now it rose to the lips of every villager. And so, they tried to bargain. They burned offerings, slaughtered lambs and birds, left them at the base of the fairy chimneys. They whispered pleas to the unseen, begging the valley to take anything but their children. But the hungry ones did not want beasts. They wanted the warmth of breath, the weight of flesh. They wanted life. And they did not stop. The desperate mother. Among those who had lost a child was a woman named Elia. She had been known in the village for her gentle hands, her quiet strength. She had woven the finest garments, the warmest blankets, her stitches as delicate as whispers. She had once embroidered prayers into her son's tunic, tiny symbols of protection meant to keep him safe. But they had not saved him. She had placed him in his cradle only to wake to emptiness, to a room so unbearably still that she had known, before even seeing the cradle, that she had lost him. Elia had not spoken for 7 days. She had wandered the village like a ghost, her hands tracing the doorways, the cradles, her fingers dragging through the soot that remained as if she could still touch her son through it. Then, on the 7th night, she spoke. "The fire," she said. The elders looked at her, confused. "They fear the fire," she murmured, her voice thin and stretched, as if she had forgotten how to use it. The men dismissed her. But the women, the mothers, listened. Fire had shaped this valley. Fire had buried whatever had once ruled this land beneath the stone. And fire could bury it again. Elia, with her eyes hollowed by grief, stood before the village and made her choice. "If they want a child," she said, "they will take me instead." She turned and walked toward the valley's heart, where the old volcanic fissures still lay, the deepest place where the heat of the world still breathed. And behind her, the women followed. The sacrifice. The wind howled as Elia entered the caves. The mothers gathered at the mouth of the tunnel, watching as she stepped into the darkness alone. She carried a torch, her only light. Her only weapon. And behind her, the wind whispered. She had barely stepped inside before she felt it. The presence. The weight of something unseen, something watching from the cracks in the stone. She did not pray. She had done that before, and her prayers had gone unheard. Instead, she spoke to them. "If you want flesh, take mine." The air thickened. The walls seemed to breathe. A voice, a chorus of voices, layered atop one another, woven into the very rock, answered. "We do not want you." A whisper, curling through the dark, crawling along her skin. "We want the ones who have just begun to burn." She lifted the torch. The hungry ones shifted. They were not used to fire. Not anymore. Not since they had been buried beneath it. She threw the torch. The flames roared to life, licking the stone, illuminating the darkness, revealing shapes that had never been meant to be seen. And they screamed. For the first time, the shadows recoiled. For the first time, the valley shook with their rage. But it was too late. She had brought more than one torch. And as the women outside saw the flames rise, they threw their own. Fire filled the caves. It devoured the tunnels, sealed the cracks, turned the air to thick, choking smoke. The hungry ones fled, fled deeper into the earth, fled from the light, fled from the one thing they had feared since the first fire had shaped the land. Elia never left the cave. She had known she never would. But the children stopped vanishing. And in the morning, as the valley stood quiet once more, the people whispered her name. And they called her the mother who burned. The waiting darkness. Years passed. The valley, for a time, was at peace. The fires had sealed the hungry ones away. But the mothers still whispered Elia's name over their children's cradles, sewing prayers into their blankets, telling them of the woman who had given herself to the flames. And yet, the people knew. Deep in their bones, they knew. The hungry ones were not gone. Only buried. Only waiting. And long after the last of those who had witnessed the first vanishing had turned to dust, long after the village had been abandoned, long after the ruins of Soganli had been left to time, the wind would still carry the scent of ash. And the whispers would never truly fade. Chapter 4. A nomadic people find a silent valley. The endless journey. The wind howled over the steppes, rolling over the backs of horses and carrying the dust of distant lands. The Turkic nomads, wanderers of the Great Plains, had spent generations moving from place to place, their lives dictated by the rhythm of nature. They followed the rivers, seeking fertile lands for their animals, shelter from the bitter cold, and the promise of a future free from hunger. But the land was never kind for long. Winters stretched longer than they should have. The rivers dried too soon. And the world, as vast as it seemed, grew more dangerous with every step. The tribes had splintered, some choosing to go further east, others south, but one small group, a band of 40 families, pressed westward, deeper into the unknown. Among them was Agana. She was a woman of sharp mind and steady hands, known for her skill in embroidery, a craft she had learned from her mother before her. She stitched prayers into fabric, weaving symbols of protection, of faith, of memories too sacred to be spoken aloud. She was also one of the few among her people who had embraced the new faith, the teachings of a man who had walked the earth centuries ago, who had spoken of love, sacrifice, and salvation. She carried her beliefs quietly, as one carried an ember wrapped in cloth, protected but still burning. But as they approached the valley, as the jagged spires of the Fairy Chimneys rose from the horizon, Agana felt something within her tighten. She did not know why. Only that this place was different. And it did not welcome them. The first night in the valley. The valley of Soganli stood before them, carved by time, shaped by the hands of fire and wind. Its towering formations, the fairy chimneys, loomed like the pillars of an abandoned temple, hollowed out by forces unknown. The nomads were weary. Their horses were thin, their food stores low. They had lost people along the way, some to sickness, others to the unforgiving wilderness. This valley, with its high cliffs and hidden caves, offered something they had not known in months: shelter. And so, they entered. The air was still, unnaturally so. No birds sang. No animals moved through the grass. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. But they did not see this as a warning. They saw it as an opportunity. They moved into the valley, setting up their yurts at the base of the rock formations, driving stakes into the earth, securing their livestock. Fire was lit. Food was prepared. And for the first time in weeks, they rested. But as the flames flickered, casting shadows against the stone, Agana stood apart. She traced her fingers over the smooth surface of the rock, her heart beating too fast. There was something beneath the stone. Something watching. She could not explain how she knew. Only that the moment she had stepped into the valley, something unseen had shifted. Had stirred. And in the wind, she thought she heard a whisper. The valley remembers. Morning came, and with it, the nomads explored. The valley stretched far, deeper than they had expected. Caves lined the hills, some shallow, others so deep they swallowed the light whole. The ground, though dry, held the memory of fire, blackened stones, veins of old ash buried beneath the dust. It was a place shaped by ancient violence. Yet, there was no sign of people. No ruins, no graves, no tools left behind. It was as if those who had come before had been erased. The elders took this as a good omen, the valley was theirs to claim. But Agana did not believe in good omens. She stood at the mouth of one of the larger caves, staring into the darkness within. Her fingers trembled as she touched the rock. It was warm. As if something beneath it still breathed. The unease that grew. The nomads remained in the valley, their presence becoming a part of it. They carved their homes into the chimneys, finding the rock soft enough to shape yet sturdy enough to protect them from storms. They hunted in the hills, gathered roots from the forest's edge, planted seeds in the riverbanks. And for a time, life was good. But the valley did not forget. It did not want them there. And soon, the signs began. Shadows that stretched too far in the firelight. Whispers in the wind when no one spoke. The faint scent of ash lingering in the air, even when no fire had burned. At first, the people ignored it. Then the animals began to react. The horses refused to enter certain parts of the valley. The dogs growled at empty spaces. The sheep, usually calm, trembled in the night, huddling together as if waiting for a storm. And Agana knew. She could feel it. A presence, something without form, without body. It was watching. It was waiting. And one day, it would move. The vision. The night she saw it, the valley was silent. Too silent. Agana sat outside her home, a small cave she had hollowed out herself, her embroidery resting in her lap. She had been sewing protective symbols into a child's tunic, stitching the same prayers her mother had once sewn for her. The fire beside her crackled. The wind barely stirred. Then, something changed. The flames shuddered. The shadows moved. And in the distance, just beyond the nearest ridge, something shifted. Something rose. It had no shape. No form. Only darkness, a presence that swallowed the light around it. She could not move. Could barely breathe. Then, the whisper came. Not yet. Her body snapped forward, air flooding her lungs as if she had been drowning. The fire was normal again. The shadows were still. But the valley was not empty. Not anymore. The warning. The next morning, Agana spoke to the elders. She told them of the presence, of the way the land had shifted, of the whisper that had crawled beneath her skin. They did not listen. It is your faith, they said. You have spent too much time with your prayers. But Agana knew prayers could not stop this. She had felt it. Something in this valley had been waiting. And now, it was awake. The beginning of the end. The people of Soganli had come seeking shelter. What they had found was a place that had never forgotten. The valley had allowed them to stay, had let them build their homes, plant their crops, bring their children into its shadow. But it was not mercy. It was patience. The hungry ones did not strike in the beginning. They waited. They listened. They let the people feel safe. Because when the time came, when the first child vanished without a sound, when the first cradle was left cold and empty, when the whispers in the caves became voices that spoke of hunger, it would be too late. And Agana would be the only one who had seen it coming. Chapter 5, The Unseen Watchers. The whispers begin. The Valley of Soganli had given shelter, food, and the illusion of safety to the Turkic nomads who had settled among its towering rock formations. For years, life had been peaceful, the people living as they always had, herding their animals, carving homes into the fairy chimneys, raising their children beneath the open sky. But peace is a fragile thing. And the valley had not forgotten. It began with the children. They were the first to notice. The first to see the things the adults could not. It started with the whispers. At first, they were nothing but fleeting murmurs. Soft voices carried on the wind. The adults dismissed them as nothing more than the sound of air moving through the caves, the natural moan of the valley's breath. But the children knew better. They listened. And soon, they saw figures. Shadowy forms watching from the cliffs, from the caves, from the narrow crevices between the rock formations. They did not move. They did not step forward. They only stood, waiting, watching. And always, when the figures appeared, the wind carried the faint scent of ash. The first signs. The children tried to speak of it. Tried to tell their parents, their elders, that they were being watched. But they were not believed. It is the shadows playing tricks, the adults said. It is your imagination, the mothers whispered, pulling them close, pressing protective symbols into their foreheads, whispering prayers against evil. And so the children grew quiet. But they still saw. The watchers did not leave. They did not fade into dreams. And though no one else spoke of them, the children knew. They knew the figures were real. And they knew they were waiting. The vanishing shepherds. The first man to disappear was Oraz. He was one of the shepherds, a quiet man who spent more time with his animals than with people. He had been in the hills, watching over the flock as he always did. By nightfall, when the others returned, he did not come home. At first, they thought nothing of it. Shepherds often stayed in the fields overnight if they lost track of time. But by morning, he was still gone. The men of the village set out in search of him. They found his flock untouched, grazing near the ridge. But there was no sign of Oraz. Not at first. Not until one of the hunters noticed the tracks leading away from the herd. A single set of human footprints trailing into the hills. The men followed them for miles, their voices echoing against the cliffs, calling his name. Then, the tracks stopped. No sign of struggle. No sign of where he could have gone. Just empty space where the footprints ended. It was as if he had vanished into the air. 3 days passed. And then, Oraz came back. The return of the hollow-eyed. It was just before dawn when he staggered into the village. His clothes were torn, his face gaunt, his lips cracked and bloodied. But it was his eyes that silenced the village. They were empty. Not blind, not lifeless. Hollow. As if he had seen something so vast, so terrible, that it had taken everything from him. He did not speak. Not when his wife wept and threw her arms around him. Not when the elders questioned him. Not when the healer touched his forehead and murmured prayers of protection. He simply stared past them all, his body trembling, his skin cold despite the heat of the day. And always, when he moved, the air around him carried the scent of ash. For days, they tried to reach him. He did not eat. He did not drink. He only sat, silent, staring at something no one else could see. Then, one night, he walked into the river and never came back. The next shepherd disappeared 2 weeks later. The same way. The same return. The same hollow eyes. The same ash-scented air. And before the next moon had passed, it was clear. The valley was taking them. One by one. The elders, warning. The village gathered in the greatest of the stone dwellings, the hall where decisions were made. The elders sat in silence, their faces grim. They had known the valley was strange. They had seen the shadows stretch too long at dusk, heard the wind whisper where no one spoke. But this was different. This was hunger. And so, for the first time, they spoke openly of the stories passed from generation to generation. The stories of ancient things buried beneath the land. The stories of creatures that did not belong to the world of men. The stories of hunger that could not be seen, only felt. And they spoke of the only thing the hungry ones desired. Sorrow. Loss. The souls of the newborn. For it was not the grown men they wanted. It was grief. It was emptiness. It was the taste of something freshly lost. And the elders feared that what had begun with the shepherds would not end with them. Because soon, the hungry ones would come for the children. The mothers, fear. When Agana heard the warning, she felt the weight of it settle into her bones. She had known, from the first moment she entered the valley, that something had been waiting. Now, she knew what it was waiting for. The children. And so, the women of the village tightened their grip on their little ones. They hung charms above their doors, wove protective patterns into their clothes. They lit candles at night, whispering prayers that flickered in the dark. But Agana knew, deep in her soul, that prayers would not be enough. The watching figures. The watchers did not leave. They did not disappear. And soon, the village began to see them too. No longer just whispers in the children's voices. No longer just figures in the corner of the eye. They were real. Standing at the edges of the valley. Perched atop the fairy chimneys, where the wind howled the loudest. Peering from the shadows of caves, their forms just out of reach of the torchlight. They did not step forward. They did not speak. They only waited. And the people of Soganli realized too late. The valley was not theirs. It never had been. And now, it was too late to leave. The faint scent of ash. The scent became stronger. It clung to the air like an omen. It wove into the fabric of their clothes, their homes, their skin. And the wind carried with it a whisper, one no one dared to hear. A whisper that did not ask, did not threaten. It simply promised. Soon.